All right, Shalom. First and foremost, I want to give all praises, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahasham, Yahweh Shai, Bahasham, Racha Kodash. Double honors to the apostles and the elders of Great Millstone, and peace and blessings to the elect. All right, just a continuation, all right, of Daniel, the 11th chapter. Okay, last time we left off, or we ended about the 14th verse. Okay, and so, today I'm going to go through Lord's willing 15 through 17. All right, and Lord's will be edifying. Okay, so in Daniel 11 and 14, all right, or in the verses above, we're basically at the point where you have Antiochus the third, the Great, okay, who he goes to war with Ptolemy the fourth, all right, Philopator. He ends up losing that war, okay, but he's able to retreat and then come back again, all right, stronger. Okay, but this time when he comes back, he's dealing with Ptolemy's son, all right, which was Ptolemy the fifth, Epiphanes. Okay, so Daniel 11 and 15, it says, "So the king of the north shall come." All right, now the king of the north at this time is Antiochus the third, the Great. Okay, so it says, "So the king of the north shall come and cast up a mount and take the most fenced cities, and the arms of the south shall not withstand." Okay, and when Antiochus got defeated, all right, he retreated. When he came back, all right, or he made his return, all right, he started conquering down, from Syria on down. All right. He started, Tyre, Sidon, Phoenicia, basically that whole Palestinian area. And who else is in that area? In Coal, Syria, Israel. Okay. So as it says here, and the arms of the south shall not withstand, because nobody was able to basically defend against him. All right, because when he came back, he came with a large army, right? So it says, neither his chosen people. And who are the chosen people? All right, the nation of Israel. So when Antiochus, because remember, as these kings go to war over these different territories, we become subject to whatever king wins or is ruling at the time or has dominion over the other at the time. All right, so for a minute, we were under the rule of the Ptolemies. Okay. And now when Antiochus, finally came back and he starts taking back all this territory, he has rule over us. As it says here, the arms of the south shall not withstand, neither his chosen people, neither shall there be any strength to withstand. So nobody was able to fight back against Antiochus the third when he came. All right, he started taking over the regions in Palestine, heading on down south towards Egypt. Okay. Verse 16 says, "But he that cometh against him shall do according to his own will, and none shall stand before him. And he shall stand in the glorious land, which is by his hand, which by his hand shall be consumed." So once again, still dealing with Antiochus, he was the one that was coming against Ptolemy at this point. That's why he's conquering all these lands, and he's headed where? He's headed south. All right. And he was doing according to his will, all right, taking over these different lands, and nobody was able to stand up before him. Nobody was able to resist against him. All right. And he shall stand in the glorious land, all right, which is the land of Israel, which by his hand shall be consumed, because we became subject, all right, under Antiochus or the Seleucids, all right, again, because now they were the ones who had taken us over. Verse 17 says, he shall also set his face to enter with the strength of his whole kingdom, and upright ones with him. Thus shall he do, and he shall give him the daughter of women, corrupting her, but he shall not stand on his Slakia, but she shall not stand on his side, neither before him. Now, once again, the reason why this can be confusing is because of the pronouns, right? The he and the she. Who's the he? Who's the she? Okay, but in here, all right, the he that set his face to enter was Antiochus, because what was he doing? He's making his way down towards Egypt, all right, and he was going to what? To invade, all right, and take it over, which had been his plan from before, when he even teamed up with Philip the Fifth of Macedon. His plan was to invade and take it over. All right. It says, "and upright ones with him." Now, at this time, okay, when you go into, for example, all right, we already know who the upright ones are. All right, it starts with the elect, but really it's the whole nation, because the whole nation of Israel was created to be a upright. Of course, now you have wicked individuals, all right, but the Lord made us to be what? A nation of priests, and kings, so on and so forth. So now this is the book of Psalms, chapter 11, verse 2. It says, "For lo, the wicked bend their bow. They make ready their arrow upon the string, that they may privately shoot at the upright in heart." Okay. Now, they do that, okay, really to target us, and they focus more on the elect. But are the elect the only ones that these elites or these devils are shooting at? No, they're coming after the whole nation. Psalms 83. They have said, "Let us cut them off from being a people, that the name of Israel may cease." Okay. So really the whole nation, and ultimately in the kingdom, we're gonna see that, all right, that whole nation, all right, is gonna be we're gonna be what? An upright, people. All right. Now, when you go in here, you had certain Israelites, okay, that were, whether sellout, okay, or some that just, were in the armies, okay, of these different kings. You had certain Israelites that were in Alexander the Great, or the Greeks' army. You had certain Israelites that were in Ptolemy's army, because wherever, you had Jake, you would always have certain Israelites that were part of, that had different lots, that would be warriors. So they would be a part of the army of whatever nation they were under. So, for example, you had a lot of Israelites that were in Alexandria, Egypt. So you mean to tell me, an example being the Fourth Syrian War, when Ptolemy went to war with Antiochus the Third, and they gathered the Greeks and they gathered the native Egyptians. You mean to tell me they didn't have any Israelites that fought in their armies? Of course they did. All right. So same thing, you had certain Israelites that were in these different nations' army. Now, when you read in the book of Maccabees, it even tells you how there were certain kings. I forget their names at the very moment, but some of those Greek kings hired Jake to come and fight in their army for them. Okay, against the opposing forces. Okay, so as it says, "and upright ones with him, thus shall he do," and that is what he did. Okay, he came, all right, and he had this whole intention to what? To go and invade Egypt. All right, now it says, "and he shall give him the daughter of women." The he, all right, was talking about Antiochus the third. Okay, and he gave the him that he gave the daughter to was Ptolemy the fifth. All right, and the daughter of women, that daughter was Cleopatra. All right, the first Syra. Okay, so in essence, Antiochus the third gave Ptolemy the fifth his daughter Cleopatra. All right, and as it says, corrupting her, but she shall not stand on his side, neither before him. Because the reason he gave, which we're going to read the secular history on it, but the reason he gave Cleopatra to Ptolemy, all right, was a form of, a marriage alliance, but it was really to try and control him. All right, that's why he corrupted her, like to try and, because Ptolemy was young. All right, he was a young boy. Okay, so Antiochus could, in a sense, have Ptolemy as his puppet ruler through his daughter. Okay, but it didn't end up working that way. Okay, but because it says she shall not stand on his side, neither before him. So after she married Ptolemy, she basically rocked with Ptolemy. All right, instead of doing the bidding of her father, and basically, playing that role. that double agent type joint. Okay, so now let's read here. In the secular history, we have here Antiochus and the Jews. Now, and of course, these different Seleucid kings and these different Ptolemaic kings, you had certain very, very evil ones. You had certain ones that just dealt cordially with us. All right, now dealing with Antiochus the third, when you read about the accounts and the encounter that he had with Israel, as it even says in the Josephus, he wasn't, as bad as Antiochus Epiphanes, all right, which was his son. Okay, Antiochus Epiphanes was just a straight up demon. Okay, but let's read here. It says on the section of Antiochus and the Jews, it says Antiochus the third resettled 2,000 Jewish families from Babylonia into the Hellenistic Anatolian regions of Lydia and Phrygia. He is not the king of the Hanukkah story, who was resisted by the Maccabees. Yeah, because that was, like it says, rather that was his son Antiochus the fourth, Epiphanes, the one that we all know and hate. Right? So it says, on the contrary, Josephus portrays him, all right, as friendly towards the Jews of Jerusalem and cognizant, all right, of their loyalty to him. And it tells you where you can find that. Antiquities of the Jews, chapter 3, sections 3 and 4. It says, in stark contrast to the attitude of his son. In fact, Antiochus III lowered taxes, granted subversions to the temple, and let the Jews live, as Josephus puts it, according to the law of their forefathers. All right. Now we're gonna go up because remember it says that what did Antiochus do? He gave Ptolemy his daughter, all right, the daughter of women, which was Cleopatra, corrupting her. Okay, so now let's look up Antiochus. All right, when you go to his family section here, all right, it says here that Antiochus and Laodice had 8 children, 3 sons and 5 daughters. Okay, now they had Antiochus, all right, one of their sons, and then you had Seleucus the fourth Philopator, all right, which was the successor after Antiochus the third. He's gonna come up later on in the chapter. It says you had Ardes, you had unnamed daughter, you had Laodice the fourth, all right, and then you had who? Cleopatra the first, Syra. And as it says here, married in 193 BC, Ptolemy the fifth Epiphanes of Egypt. And we're going to read that account of that. Okay. And then you had Antiochus, all right, which I believe Antiochus, all right, with the I is the female version of Antiochus. You have masculina and masculino, however you say it, and feminina, right? Feminine and masculine. And then you had Mithridates. See, we know him commonly as what? Antiochus Epiphanes, but his actual name was Mithridates. Okay. And he's also going to come up later on in the chapter, all right, as the true demon that he was. But notice it says he succeeded his brother, Ptolemy the fourth Philopator, because they were brothers. All right. It just Seleucus, like I said, Ptolemy, Seleucus the fourth. Seleucus ruled before him. All right. So the main characters that we're dealing with here would be Antiochus the third, right? He's the father right now that we're dealing with. He has his 2 main sons that we focus on later on in the chapter, which is Seleucus the fourth, Philopator, all right, or Philopator. He's the king you read about in the book of Maccabees that sent Heliodorus to go to the temple and get all the money and so on and so forth. And the angels came down and beat Heliodorus' ass. That's him. And then you also have Mithridates, who we know as Antiochus Epiphanes. But for today, we're focusing on Cleopatra. So let's see. It says here, Cleopatra the first of Syra, it says, was a princess of the Seleucid Empire. Okay. Because it was named after Seleucus, all right, the first. Now it says Queen of Ptolemaic Egypt by marriage to Ptolemy the fifth of Egypt, and regent of Egypt during the minority of their son Ptolemy the sixth, from her husband's death in 180 BC until her own death in 176 BC. It says Cleopatra was the daughter of Antiochus the third the Great, king of the Seleucid Empire, and Queen Laodice III. So remember, going back to Daniel 11, that 11 and 17, the latter part says that, and he shall give him the daughter of women. So Antiochus III, the Great, was going to give Ptolemy the fifth the daughter of women, which was his daughter Cleopatra. All right. So it says here, in 197 BC, Antiochus III had captured a number of cities in Asia Minor, previously under the control of the Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt. The Romans supported the Egyptians' interests when they negotiated with the Seleucid king in Lysimachia in 196 BC. In response, Antiochus III indicated his willingness to make peace with Ptolemy V. That's why, see, he came all the way there. All right, it says, he shall set his face to enter with the strength of his whole kingdom. So he came all the way there ready to take it over. All right, which when you read in the fifth Syrian war, it tells you, all right, I'm gonna read this quick portion and then we'll go back. It tells you here, it says, seeking to take advantage of this turmoil. What turmoil? The court intrigue that was happening upon Ptolemy V's ascension to power, because he was a young boy. Antiochus saw that and he wanted to take advantage of that, right? So it says, Antiochus III staged a second invasion of Coal Syria. He convinced Philip V of Macedon to join the war and conquer Ptolemy's territories in Asia Minor, actions which led to the Second Macedonian War between Macedon and the Romans. Antiochus quickly swept through the region, all right, after a brief setback at Gaza, delivering a crushing blow to the Ptolemies at the Battle of Panium near the head of the River Jordan, which earned him the important port of Zidon, all right, or Sidon, which was one of those fenced cities that, as we read, all right, going up to Daniel 11:15, that he was going to take the most fenced cities. Okay. Now, going on, it says, all right, it says here, in 200 BC, Roman emissaries came to Philip and Antiochus, demanding that they refrain from invading Egypt. Okay, because what was his plans? He took all these different lands and he was coming straight down. And what was he coming to do? His own will, right? He was coming to take over Egypt. He had set his whole face to enter to take over Egypt. But the Romans intervened. Okay, and so they demanded that Antiochus refrain from invading Egypt. Why? It's going to tell you the Romans would not suffer or would suffer no disruption to the import of grain from Egypt. So they used to import grain from Egypt to support their population. All right. And so if they allowed Antiochus to go and mess with their ally, that would affect their grain supply, and they can afford to suffer that. It says key to supporting the massive population in Italy. Because remember, at this time, Rome is growing. All right, it's growing and it's expanding, and so the population is growing as well. It says, as neither monarch had planned to invade Egypt itself, they willingly complied to Rome's demands. Antiochus completely subjugated, or Antiochus completed the subjugation of Coal Syria, meaning all Syria, which he took it over in 198 BC and went on to raid Ptolemy's remaining coastal strongholds in Caria and Cilicia. Okay, so that's why it goes into about him taking those areas, those fenced cities were located in Syria. He took it over, but there's more. Problems at home led Ptolemy to seek a quick and disadvantageous conclusion. The nativist movement, which began before the war with with the Egyptian revolt and expanded with the support of Egyptian priests, created turmoil and sedition throughout the kingdom. Economic troubles led to the Ptolemaic government to increase taxation, which in turn fed the nationalist fire. So there was a lot of, let's just say civil unrest and disruption going on, all right, in Egypt at this time. That's why Antiochus was trying to take advantage of that. It says, in order to focus on the home front, Ptolemy signed a conciliatory treaty with Antiochus in 195 BC, leaving the Seleucid king in possession of Syria and agreeing to marry Antiochus's daughter, Cleopatra the First. All right, and that's what we're reading about here. That's why it says that in verse 17 that he shall give him the daughter of women. All right. So let's finish reading this part right here, and that's pretty much it. All right. It says in 197 BC, Antiochus III captured a number of cities in Asia Minor, um, previously under the control of the Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt. The Roman, because the Ptolemies did not only did they have Egypt, but they had certain territories that they had rule over that were also in Asia Minor, or in the Aegean Sea, or in around those coastal areas as well. So it says the Romans supported the Egyptian interest. Remember, because they needed the grain import. It says when they negotiated with the Seleucid king in Lysimachia in 196 BC. In response, Antiochus III indicated his willingness to make peace with Ptolemy V and to have his daughter Cleopatra I marry Ptolemy V. They were betrothed in 195 BC, and their marriage took place in 193 in Raphia. At that time, Ptolemy was about 16 years and Cleopatra was about 10 years old. So they were young. All right. Later on, Egypt's Ptolemaic kings were to argue that Cleopatra had received Syria as her dowry, and therefore this territory again belonged to Egypt. It is not clear if this was the case. However, in practice, Syria remained a Seleucid possession after the Battle of Panium in 198 BC. So if Syria remained under control of the Seleucids, then guess what? Israel, being in that location, would remain under the possession of the Seleucids until somebody else was to come and take them down and set themselves up over us. All right. So that means that Antiochus the third had control over us, right? He was the king basically over us, but that would also mean that his heir or his son would also be king over us, okay? And his son after that. That's why we had to be subject onto Heliodorus or Seleucus when they came to collect the money from the temple. All right. It says in Alexandria, Cleopatra I was called the Syrian. As part of the Ptolemaic cult, she was honored with her husband as Theoi or Theoi Epiphanes. It says in line with ancient Egyptian tradition, she was also named Adelphi, which equals sister, or of Ptolemy V. See, so that because them Egyptians would be doing that kind of stuff. All right, that incest BS. So even if she wasn't his direct sister, they would basically try to through their tradition they would either call her that or signify her as his sister, which is some weird shit. But all right. So it says a synod of priests held at Memphis in 185 BC transferred all honors that Ptolemy V had received in 196 BC, which is written on the Rosetta Stone, to his wife. And it says, and in 187 BC, Cleopatra was appointed vizier because she marries Ptolemy, but eventually Ptolemy died, and their son was too young to rule, so she ended up ruling on his behalf. Okay, but that's pretty much it. All right, dealing with Daniel 11 and 15 through 17 is not really that much information, but it's just going really into Antiochus reconquering all the different territories, all right, in Syria, all right, all the way down to Egypt, and then eventually he basically, which also included us as well, but he eventually made that covenant or that treaty, all right, with Ptolemy through his daughter Cleopatra. All right. So I'm pretty much gonna end it here. All right. Lord's will, I'll come back next time. We can go through, you know, um, a couple other verses, because now we're getting into the part, all right, that deals with Antiochus Epiphanes. It deals with Seleucus and so on and so forth. Okay. The 16th chapter or the verse. Okay, yeah, let me go back. Salakia. All right, so Daniel 11 and 16, it says, "But he that cometh against him shall do according to his own will, and none shall stand before him, and he shall stand in the glorious land, which by his hand shall be consumed." So that he that was coming against him, the he here is referring on to Antiochus the third, and he was coming against Ptolemy. Okay, so it says, "He that cometh against him shall do according to his own will." All right, and none shall stand before him, because as Antiochus was doing all of this, let's go back here. He saw that there was a lot of disturbances in Egypt. All right, so he basically said, all right, he's going to take advantage of that, and so he started conquering the different portions of Syria, which Ptolemy had originally had control over. All right, so he set his mind to continue conquering and taking over those lands all the way up until getting towards Egypt. All right, so that he that was coming was Antiochus, and he was coming against Ptolemy, and he was basically doing according to his own will. It says, "And none shall stand before him," because as he was taking over these different lands, nobody was able to fight back or resist against Antiochus's army. It says, "And he shall stand in the glorious land, which is the land of Israel, which by his hand shall be consumed." Because being that we are also in that region of Syria, when he took that land over, he also took us over. So now we were consumed, meaning we became subject under Antiochus the third. Because when we went into a couple of verses above, we were subject onto the Ptolemies, because after that fourth Syrian war, Ptolemy ended up winning, and he ended up subjecting us under him. And that's what goes into the book of Third Maccabees and what he did to us. So now, now Antiochus retakes that over, and now we're subject onto the Seleucids. And then, it goes on, so on and so forth. Ayan the bar. So so that was pretty much it on that. Like I said, I'm gonna end it here. Lord's will, whenever the spirit hits me next time, I'll come back and continue on in there. But it's really just secular history, just linking it up with it. The only thing that gets a little confusing is the pronouns, so that's why, you gotta read about what is it saying that this individual is doing. And that's how you'll be able to identify, okay, who is who, and so on and so forth. So with that, I hope you were edified. In closing, I want to give all praises, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahasham, Yahweh Shai, Bahasham, Rakha Kodash. Until next time, Shalom.